Hill 609, Tunisia, April 1943. The fog lifts off the ridge in slow gray sheets, and two patrols find themselves staring at each other from 20 yards apart. No warning, no artillery barrage to announce the moment. Just German soldiers and American soldiers suddenly face to face, rifles already rising. For the Germans, every shot meant a bolt thrown back, a brass case ejected, a fresh round chambered by hand. For the Americans, it meant only a trigger, pulled again and again and again. In the time it took one side to work a bolt, the other had already fired twice. The skirmish was over in seconds, and it would not be the last time that gap in speed decided who walked away from a hillside in North Africa. If you've ever wondered why American GIs carried a rifle that German soldiers came to fear, and in some cases scavenge off the dead, stay with us. This is the story of the M1 Garand, the weapon that quietly rewrote the rules of infantry combat, and the German Kar 98K, a masterpiece of engineering that simply could not keep pace with it. Before we go further, if stories like this one, stories of the men, the weapons, and the decisions that shaped the outcome of the Second World War, matter to you, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep histories like this one alive. To understand what happened on that ridge in Tunisia, you have to go back more than a decade earlier to a quiet workshop at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. John Candius Garand was not a soldier. He was a toolmaker, a Canadian-born engineer who anglicized his name to John when his family moved to Connecticut as a boy. He spent the 1920s in that workshop, refining a single stubborn idea that a rifle could reload itself. At the time, this was almost heresy. Every major army on Earth, American, German, British, Soviet, Japanese, fought with bolt-action rifles. A soldier fired, then physically worked a bolt to eject the spent case and chamber a new round. It was the system that had dominated the trenches of the First World War, and most military planners assumed it always would. Garand believed otherwise. Working largely alone, he engineered a gas-operated system, one that used a small amount of the expanding gas from each fired round to cycle the action automatically. Pull the trigger, and the rifle did the rest. No bolt to throw, no hand taken off the stock, just the next shot, instantly available. It was not a smooth road. An early version of Garand's rifle, chambered for a smaller .276 cartridge, showed enormous promise in testing during the early 1930s. But in 1932, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, concerned about the enormous stockpile of standard .30-06 ammunition already sitting in U.S. arsenals, ordered the project redesigned around the existing caliber. Garand adapted. The result, finalized and adopted as the standard U.S. service rifle in 1936, was designated the M1. It replaced the bolt-action M1903 Springfield, a rifle that had served American soldiers since before the First World War. The M1 was the first semi-automatic rifle ever to become the standard-issue infantry weapon of a major world power. 3,000 miles away, Germany was making the opposite bet. The Karabiner 98 Kurds, the Kar 98K, became the Wehrmacht's standard rifle in June 1935. It was not a new design. It was a refinement of the Mauser bolt-action system, a mechanism so well engineered that variations of it had already armed nations for nearly 4 decades. German engineers shortened the barrel for better handling, improved the sights, and streamlined production. By the time war broke out in September 1939, the Kar 98K was in the hands of nearly every frontline German infantryman. It was, by almost universal agreement among historians and firearms experts, one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever built. Rugged, accurate, simple to manufacture, and simple to maintain. German military doctrine never intended for it to be the primary source of infantry firepower anyway. That role belonged to the squad's machine gun, with riflemen providing support and precision fire. But doctrine is one thing. The reality of close combat is another. The M1 Garand entered combat against German forces for the first time during the Deep Raid in August 1942, carried by a small number of U.S. Rangers alongside British and Canadian troops. Months later, in November 1942, it arrived in North Africa during Operation Torch. At first, M1s were issued alongside older bolt-action Springfields, as American factories raced to scale up production. But as 1943 wore on, more and more Garands reached the front. By the time American troops fought their way up the boot of Italy, and especially by the time they hit the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the M1 Garand had become the rifle the entire U.S. Army carried into battle, and German soldiers noticed the difference immediately. A bolt-action rifle in skilled hands could be fired quickly, perhaps one aimed shot every 2 or 3 seconds. But every one of those shots required the rifleman to break his sight picture, work the bolt, and reacquire his target. The M1 Garand eliminated that interruption entirely. A trained American infantryman could deliver 8 aimed shots from his en-bloc clip in roughly the time it took a German rifleman to deliver 3 or 4. That difference mattered most exactly where it was most dangerous, at close range, in the chaos of sudden contact when there was no time to think and only time to react. Encounters like the one on Hill 609 were happening across every front American troops fought on, and accounts from German soldiers recorded in post-war interviews and unit histories describe a growing wariness of American riflemen, not because the Germans lacked courage or skill, but because the firepower math had simply changed beneath their feet. There was something else, too, something almost theatrical. When a Garand's 8-round clip was spent, the empty clip ejected automatically with a sharp metallic ping. For decades afterward, this became part of American military folklore, the story that German soldiers learned to listen for that ping and would charge the moment they heard it, knowing the rifleman's gun was empty. It's a vivid story. It is also, according to most ballistics historians and veteran accounts gathered after the war, almost certainly exaggerated, a piece of battlefield legend more than documented tactical doctrine. In the noise of actual combat, with dozens of rifles firing simultaneously, picking out a single clip ejecting from one weapon was far harder than the legend suggests. We tell you this not to diminish the story, but because on this channel we draw a hard line between what is documented and what is folklore, and we'd rather you know the difference. What is documented, beyond any dispute, is the industrial story behind the rifle, and it may be the most important part of this entire history. Springfield Armory began full production of the M1 in 1937, building roughly 100 rifles a day by January 1940. As America mobilized for war, that number exploded. By January 1944, Springfield Armory was producing over 122,000 M1 rifles in a single month, nearly 4,000 rifles a day around the clock. Winchester Repeating Arms became a second manufacturer, contributing more than 500,000 additional rifles during the war. Combined, the two companies built over 4 million M1 Garands for the war effort. That number is the real story. Germany built superb individual rifles. America built an avalanche of very good ones, and an avalanche, in war, beats a masterpiece every time. This is what General George S. Patton understood when, on January 26, 1945, he sat down and wrote a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the Army's Chief of Ordnance. In that letter, preserved today in the National Archives, Patton wrote the line that would outlive him by 8 decades. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. It wasn't a throwaway line for a press release. It was a private letter from a general who had fought in 2 world wars, who had seen what bolt-action rifles could and could not do in 1918, and who was now watching a new generation of American soldiers fight with something fundamentally different in their hands. Patton went on in that same letter to praise American mortars, artillery, and tanks as without equal, but it was the rifle he led with, the weapon every single infantryman carried, the one that, multiplied across millions of American hands, changed what an infantry squad could do under fire. By contrast, German engineers were not blind to what was happening. They knew the Kar 98K, for all its precision, was being outpaced in raw firepower. Germany scrambled late in the war to field semi-automatic and even fully automatic rifles of its own, the Gewehr 43 and the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44, weapons that, in some ways, pointed toward the future of infantry small arms more clearly than the Garand did. But these programs came too late, in too small numbers, competing for resources against a collapsing war economy. The Kar 98K remained the rifle most German soldiers carried until the end, a brilliant design serving a doctrine the battlefield itself was leaving behind. There is a quieter way to measure all of this, away from production charts and generals' letters. It's in the captured weapons. Throughout the war, and in the years after, it became common for soldiers on both sides to pick up enemy rifles off the dead and the surrendered, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of necessity. Kar 98K rifles were prized as trophies by American GIs, beautifully made souvenirs of a beaten enemy. But there are far fewer documented cases of German soldiers preferring a captured Garand for actual use, not because the M1 was somehow inferior, but because of one practical, unglamorous fact: ammunition. A captured Garand was useless to a German unit without a steady supply of American 30-06 cartridges and en-bloc clips, something the Wehrmacht supply lines simply could not provide. The M1 was a rifle built for an army that could feed it. Germany increasingly could not feed its own weapons, let alone someone else's. That, in the end, is the real shape of this story. It isn't really a story about one rifle being better than another in some abstract sense. Gun enthusiasts will debate accuracy and reliability and craftsmanship forever, and there are excellent arguments on every side. It's a story about what happens when brilliant engineering meets brilliant manufacturing at exactly the moment a war demands both. John Garand never grew rich from his invention. As a government employee at Springfield Armory, he held no personal patent rights to the rifle that bears his name. He continued working, modestly and without fanfare, until his retirement, and died in 1974. His name forever attached to a weapon carried by millions of young Americans through North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, and across the Pacific. Those young men, farm boys from Iowa, dock workers from Boston, factory hands from Detroit, were handed a rifle that asked less of them under fire than any standard infantry weapon that had come before it. It didn't require a perfect bolt throw under pressure. It didn't ask them to break their aim to reload. It simply kept firing, as fast as they could pull the trigger, for as long as the clip lasted. For an 18-year-old kneeling in a hedgerow in Normandy or crouched in volcanic ash on Iwo Jima, that single mechanical difference, gas-operated versus bolt action, may well have been the difference between coming home and not. The Kar 98K remains, by any honest measure, one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever manufactured. Precise, elegant, a weapon any engineer would be proud to have designed. But the Second World War was not won by the finest individual rifle. It was won, in no small part, by the rifle that could be built by the millions, fed by an unbroken supply chain, and fired 8 times before a German soldier could finish working his bolt a second time. That is why, on battlefields from Tunisia to the Rhine, American riflemen carried a weapon that made their enemies' beautifully engineered bolt-action rifles feel, suddenly and irreversibly, like they belonged to an earlier war. If this story moved you, if you believe these men and the weapons they carried deserve to be remembered with accuracy, not exaggeration, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and ring the bell. There are more stories like this one still waiting to be told.